Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be continuing our lecture series on World War One. Specifically, we're going to do just a brief lecture on the Russian Revolution. Russia, this entire time, has been fighting Germany on the Eastern Front. So most of what we've been talking about has been happening on the Western Front with Great Britain and France. But Russia actually is doing the majority of the fighting on the Eastern Front. And they're incurring terrible losses. The German military is just far superior to the Russian military. But the Russians have numbers in their favor. Russia is gigantic, and they have a very large population, and it's being run by the czars, the Romanov family. Czars are just like think of it as like a king, and it's Tsar Nicholas II is in charge, and he's the Romanov dynasty has been losing power for a while now. The Russians have always been in kind of an agrarian economy that is just starting to industrialize. They had a system of farming that relied upon serfs, which are essentially like indentured servants. Like the serfs are tied to a piece of land, and whoever owns that piece of land essentially kind of owns the labor of the serfs. And the czars have essentially just gotten rid of that system, and so there's like some economic turmoil there. The czars are repressive, but they're not going to be as repressive as the communists that will eventually take over. I mean, the communist regime in the Soviet Union, Russia, which will become the Soviet Union, will be one of the most repressive regimes in the history of mankind. I mean, it's awful. But the czars are no saints, and so there's a real struggle there. They're industrializing, and as they're industrializing, they're going through all the same problems that other industrializing countries are going through. It's workers are because we're all new to this, workers are being mistreated in Russia, and then the war happens. And when the war happens, Russia's just not prepared, and the czars aren't prepared, and so the Russians are being sent into war with not enough equipment, not enough guns, and it's not going well, and they're being slaughtered by a better trained, better equipped German military. Well, the czars can't bear losing this war, and so they're dumping essentially all of the country's resources into fighting this war, and they're still losing. And that means in the countryside, people are starting to starve, and there are different radical groups that are taking advantage of that. And one of those groups are the communists. The communists believe that the war is just a capitalist war being waged by businesses for profits, which is there's no evidence for that. There are businesses that are making a profit off this, but this is more about the war is more about nationalism and imperialism and militarism. Although imperialism does have an economic element to it. I mean, it is about economics, but the communists are there's two groups of them: the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. They're believers in this, in essentially creating a utopian society with, essentially equal outcomes where everybody gets treated the same. Everybody makes the same amount of money, complete government control over the economy, and that is what's best for the Russian worker or the worker just in general. Now, the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks don't necessarily agree on how to institute this utopia, which will ultimately turn into a nightmare. You can't. The equality of outcome is impossible. You can't make everybody equal. It can only be enforced by the point of gun. If your neighbor has an extra cow than you do, what are you can do? You're going to throw them in prison, and you want to live in that world. But we don't know that yet. And so the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks are essentially socialists and communists that are promoting this equality of outcome kind of idea. And they take advantage of the resentment towards the czar. And, this guy right here, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, Lenin is a pseudonym, that's his revolutionary name. They're advocating for the overthrow of the czar, and the Bolsheviks in particular are very radical. They believe that a vanguard, like this elite, intellectual elite, should lead a revolution, and that lead the masses to overthrow the czar and capitalism. And so Vladimir Lenin actually is exiled, and he's sent out of Russia by the czars. And if the communists were in charge, they would have just killed any rivals. But the czars aren't that radical, and they allow him to live in Europe. Well, the Germans know this, and the Germans want to destabilize Russia, and they make a huge mistake for the world. Because literally the communists are going to kill somewhere between 60 and 100 million people within purges once they take over. So Germany makes a huge mistake, but they think they're doing something smart. They take Vladimir Lenin and they actually sneak him back into Russia. And they do that because they want there to be domestic turmoil in Russia. So Russia's busy dealing with that and not fighting. So Germany can more easily defeat Russia on the battlefield. So they sneak Lenin into Russia, where he and the Bolsheviks help to foment a revolution that is going to kick the czars out. Now, the revolution doesn't start because of the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The revolution starts because some Navy sailors are going to mutiny against the czar. They recognize like they're not winning this fight. There's domestic turmoil. Women in the streets are, protesting and rioting over bread, because essentially the military is taking everything and people are starving. And so there is this domestic turmoil that is going on. The Navy essentially mutinies, and when the Navy mutinies is right about the time where Lenin shows back up to Russia. And because the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks have been organizing for this for a very long time, we see Lenin kind of takes over the revolution. Now, initially, a democratic interim government gets set up, but that interim government is going to be overthrown in essentially a bloodless coup led by the Bolsheviks. And Lenin takes charge. When Lenin takes charge, one of the first things that he does is he recognizes to maintain popular support in the country, he's got to get the Russians out of the war. And so, he's really, trying to appease the masses by pulling the Russians out of the war because of the loss of life, because of conscription, because of starvation that's going on within Russia. And the phrase becomes land bread peace, and the idea is no more war. We're going to get you out of the war. We're going to make sure that everybody has bread, right? And the idea is the communist idea is that everybody works according to their ability and will receive payment according to their needs, and we're going to level the playing field and make the playing field equal, and so everybody will have bread. Well, that won't happen. The idea that everybody gets paid equal disincentivizes work, and so essentially, if I get paid the same amount as you get paid, no matter how hard I work, nature, it takes over, and I'm just not going to work very hard because it doesn't benefit me to work hard. Well, if I don't work hard, then who's going to make stuff for people to buy? It doesn't just magically show up. And so, you're going to see shortages in all kinds of supplies. And so production goes down, and we're going to see that there's going to be a lack of food because there's no motivation to work hard. Plus, a lot of the farmers, once they start to collectivize, are going to have their crops taken from them by the government. They don't own, there's no private property, right? If you're going to distribute things equally, I don't own the product of my labor. The government does. The government's taking it and spreading it out equally amongst everybody. Some of the farmers start to kind of sneak a little extra. Well, they end up in prison for that, or just outright executed. As a matter of fact, the Russian government is going to mass murder the most productive farmers in their entire country. They're an ethnic group called the kulaks. They will be mass murdered because they're good at farming. Well, why would you kill somebody for being good at farming? Well, they're good at farming, and so they're farming and creating more crops than their neighbors are. And that's not equal. And so, if you're not equal, that means, if you have more than your neighbor, that means you must have stolen it to get it. And so, to enforce equality, they just essentially kill those people, which then leaves even more shortage for the bread. Now, the idea of land and land bread peace is everybody is going to get a equal share of land. There's not going to be like some rich person that owns all of the land, that they're going to divvy that up. And so the idea of land, bread, and peace really seems like the average person is like, oh my God, this is great. No more war. We'll all have bread, and we'll all have our own little plot of land. The problem is you don't own that plot of land. The government does, and you don't get to keep the product of your labor. The government is going to take it to distribute it equally. And so if you don't like that, you'll either end up dead or in prison. And so, the communist takeover is going to be devastating for the Soviet people. Somewhere between 60 and 100 million people are going to die because of communism, and essentially communism and socialism. And so, once these shortages start to happen, the government really very quickly realizes that the only way that they can keep production up is essentially slave labor. And so if people aren't going to work hard because they can get a pay raise for it, or they get to keep the profits, the only way you can get them to work hard is the threat of force, and by pointing a gun at them and telling them you're going to arrest them if they don't. And then the government figures out really quickly, well, why not just arrest them and use them for slave labor? And so that will start the gulag, not the kulak, but the gulag system within the Soviet Union. So when I said that Germany makes a huge mistake for the world, they do by unleashing Lenin on the country of Russia, because it's just going to lead to massive death and starvation, all in the name of equality. So that's the economic system that they're going to set up. That's going to be absolutely disastrous. But as far as peace goes, they're going to really quickly enter into a treaty called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty is one of the worst treaties in history. It is going to be absolutely devastating to the Russian people. Now, initially, the Soviet Union, so Russia becomes the Soviet Union when the Bolsheviks take over, so they change the name. Because they're all about equality, they don't send representatives that are experts at negotiation. They just send average people to represent the average person in Russia. Well, those average people aren't capable of negotiating. And so, the negotiations don't go very well. And Lenin realizes this really quickly and is like, oops. And he will end up sending a delegation of professionals and intellectuals to negotiate. But he wants out of the war so bad that they're willing to leave the war almost essentially at any cost, and the Germans are going to take advantage of that. This ends up being an incredibly harsh treaty for the Soviet Union. They're going to essentially lose the areas of Ukraine, Georgia, and Finland. Those are going to become independent nations. We're going to see Poland and the Baltic states of Latvia and Estonia are going to be given outright to Germany. So Germany's going to take all that. And the Soviets are going to lose about 1 million square miles of their, think about how huge that is. 100 million square miles of their land, which is their most industrial land and has most of their coal, oil, and iron production. And they lose about 55 million people because of this treaty. This is devastating. for the Soviet Union, and it's going to be part of the reason why the Soviet Union during World War II is going to want to join in to World War II, is to essentially get this land back. So this is not just devastating for the Soviet Union; it impacts the war in total, because at this point, Germany no longer has to focus on the Russians in the east and France and Great Britain in the west. Now that Russia's out, they can pull all those troops away from Russia and send them to go fight the British and the French. The British and the French are already worn out. They cannot handle the full brunt of the German military, which means this will necessitate American involvement in the war. It makes America even more necessary if the democracies, if the allies, the Entente are going to win. So, Russian Revolution, super impactful for history, because it's going to give an advantage during World War I to the Germans, which is going to necessitate American involvement. It's also super important for American history because it unleashes communism, into the world, and communism ends up becoming, one of the most brutal, repressive forms of government ever, and it's all done in the name of equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity, which is what capitalism is based on. The Russian Revolution and Communist Revolution will spread to Eastern Europe, where we see the same kind of policies put into place, which devastates the economies of Eastern Europe. They're still recovering from that today. And then the legacy of communism in, Cuba and Cambodia and in China. I mean, they're going to kill over 100 million people in their country, all in the name of equality. North Korea, it's just absolutely devastating. I don't think there, in all of history, there's not a more deadly political philosophy than socialism and communism. Socialism is just a kind of step down from communism. It allows for private ownership, but it's still government control of the economy. So Benito Mussolini it was a socialist during World War II. The Nazis, the actual name of the Nazi party is the National Socialist German Workers' Party. They were socialists as well. Devastating political philosophy for the world. Okay, that will conclude our lecture for today. As a short one on the Russian Revolution. It's super important for history that we understand why the Russian Revolution happened. Its importance towards World War I and its importance for the World War II and the Cold War later on. The battle between democracy and communism. All right. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you again shortly.